Do not wake him. Not even a single sound. Anyone who disturbs his rest will answer to me." The entire royal palace fell into complete silence when the Alpha King spoke those words, because no one had ever seen the ruler of the kingdom protect someone with such quiet certainty. For years, Damian Brooks had been known as a king who carried responsibility above everything else. He was respected for his discipline, his intelligence, and his ability to remain calm during every difficult decision. The palace knew him as a man who rarely showed emotion, a ruler who listened carefully but kept everyone at a careful distance. Yet on this night, every person inside the royal hall witnessed something they never expected. The Alpha King was standing beside an Omega healer named Ethan Hayes, protecting a moment of peace that seemed more valuable to him than any royal duty. No one understood how it happened. No one understood why the person closest to the king was someone who had arrived at the palace with no title, no wealth, and no desire for recognition. Ethan was simply a healer who had spent his life helping others. He had traveled through small communities, treating families, teaching young healers, and offering support wherever people needed him. He never expected to enter the world of royalty, and he certainly never imagined becoming the person who would change the heart of the most powerful alpha in the kingdom. The scene inside the palace created countless questions. The nobles whispered among themselves, wondering when the distant king had allowed someone to become important enough to stand beside him. The royal guards exchanged uncertain looks because they had never witnessed such a personal display of trust from Damian. Even the oldest members of the court, people who believed they understood the king better than anyone, could not explain what they were seeing. But the answer was hidden in a story that began months earlier, before the palace knew Ethan's name, before the kingdom understood his value, and before Damian realized that the person he once considered a stranger would become the one person who could reach beyond the walls he had built around himself. At that time, Damian ruled from a palace filled with admiration but very little warmth. Every day was measured by meetings, decisions, and expectations. People saw the crown, but few ever saw the person carrying it. Meanwhile, far from the royal capital, Ethan continued his quiet work without knowing that his path was about to change forever. Their worlds could not have been more different. One man carried the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders. The other carried a simple medical bag filled with tools to help ordinary people. Yet fate brought them together through an unexpected encounter that would challenge old traditions, transform the palace, and reveal that even the strongest ruler could discover something he had never searched for. Before anyone understood the bond forming between them, the kingdom would first have to learn why the Alpha King, who trusted almost no one, chose to protect one Omega above everyone else. Long before the palace learned his name, Ethan Hayes lived a life far away from royal expectations. His days began with simple routines, quiet roads, and the familiar faces of people who needed his help. He traveled between small communities carrying a worn medical bag, not because he wanted recognition, but because he believed every person deserved kindness and attention. To Ethan, healing was never about status or influence. It was about listening, understanding, and reminding people that they were not alone during difficult moments. While the royal court measured success through power, wealth, and tradition, Ethan measured it through the smiles of families who finally found hope. Hundreds of miles away, Damian Brooks experienced a completely different reality. As the Alpha King, every decision he made affected the future of the entire kingdom. His schedule was filled from sunrise until late evening with meetings, reports, and discussions about matters most citizens never knew existed. The palace admired his strength, but very few people understood the loneliness behind his position. Damian had learned that many people approached him because of his crown rather than because of who he truly was. Advisors offered carefully chosen words. Nobles followed old customs, and even friendships often carried hidden expectations. Over time, the king became skilled at separating responsibility from emotion. He believed distance was necessary because a ruler who allowed personal feelings to influence decisions could create problems for everyone depending on him. That belief shaped the way he lived, until an unexpected situation brought Ethan into his path. The first signs of change appeared in a region near the outer borders of the kingdom. Reports arrived at the palace describing communities that had struggled for years because local resources were limited and support systems were weak. When Damian reviewed the information, he discovered that one healer had been creating solutions without waiting for approval from powerful institutions. That healer was Ethan. Unlike many officials who focused on impressive presentations, Ethan focused on practical improvements that ordinary people could actually use. He trained local volunteers, organized medical supplies, and created methods that helped communities support themselves. Damien found himself curious about someone who had achieved meaningful results without seeking attention. The king expected to meet another person hoping for a position inside the royal court. Instead, he encountered someone who seemed completely uninterested in gaining influence. When Damien finally met Ethan, the difference was immediately clear. Ethan did not treat the king as an unreachable figure surrounded by authority. He spoke respectfully, but he also spoke honestly. He answered questions with confidence and explained his ideas without trying to impress anyone. For Damien, that simple honesty was unusual. He had spent years surrounded by people who carefully measured every word they said around him. Ethan was different because he was not trying to win favor. He was simply being himself. Neither man understood at that moment how important that meeting would become. Ethan believed he was only sharing knowledge that could help more people. Damien believed he was only gathering information for the kingdom. But their first conversation quietly opened a door that neither expected, creating the beginning of a connection that would eventually change the future of the entire palace. The meeting between Damien Brooks and Ethan Hayes ended without ceremony, but the conversation stayed in the king's mind long after Ethan returned to his temporary residence outside the royal district. Damien had expected a healer with ambition, someone hoping to use royal attention to secure a permanent position or personal advantage. Instead, he found a person who seemed more interested in whether his ideas could help others than whether anyone remembered his name. That difference unsettled the Alpha King because it challenged everything he had learned about people inside the palace. The following days gave Damien more opportunities to observe Ethan's work. The healer did not demand special treatment, and he never acted as though his connection to the king made him more important than anyone else. He spent mornings reviewing medical information, afternoons teaching local assistants, and evenings answering questions from people who simply needed guidance. Every action reflected the same patience Damien had noticed during their first meeting. For the first time in years, the king saw someone whose behavior did not change depending on who was watching. Ethan remained the same person whether he was speaking with villagers, young apprentices, or the ruler of the entire kingdom. That consistency made Damien curious. He began visiting the areas where Ethan worked, not as a distant ruler inspecting a project, but as someone trying to understand why this healer inspired such trust. What he discovered surprised him. Ethan did not lead through authority. He led through example. When a young assistant made a mistake, Ethan explained the solution instead of creating embarrassment. When families expressed gratitude, he reminded them that the entire community had contributed to their progress. He always redirected attention away from himself and toward the people around him. Damien had spent his life surrounded by individuals who wanted to stand closer to power. Ethan was the first person he met who seemed completely comfortable standing away from it. One afternoon, while reviewing reports together, Damien asked Ethan why he never requested anything for himself. The question caught Ethan off guard. He explained that helping people was already meaningful enough. He had never believed that kindness needed a reward attached to it. Damien listened carefully, realizing that Ethan's answer was not an attempt to appear humble. It was simply the truth. Their conversations slowly became longer. What began as discussions about medical improvements gradually included thoughts about leadership, responsibility, and the challenges of carrying expectations. Ethan noticed that behind the title of Alpha King was a person who rarely had the chance to speak honestly. Damien noticed that behind the identity of an Omega healer was someone with remarkable strength hidden beneath a gentle nature. However, not everyone in the kingdom welcomed the growing connection between them. Some members of the royal court questioned why a healer from outside traditional noble circles had gained the king's attention. They believed important decisions should remain controlled by established families and old systems. Damien recognized the concerns, but he also recognized something more important. The kingdom was changing because someone had finally brought new ideas forward. Meanwhile, Ethan remained unaware that his presence inside the royal world had already started creating discussions throughout the palace. He believed he was only doing his work, He did not know that the Alpha King who once trusted almost no one had begun waiting for their conversations, valuing his honesty, and seeing him as someone unlike anyone he had known before. Their connection was still new, but the first walls around Damien's guarded heart had already begun to fall. As Ethan Hayes continued his work near the royal capital, the influence of his efforts became impossible for the palace to ignore. Reports from different regions began arriving with the same message. Communities were becoming stronger, local healers were working together more effectively, and families were receiving support faster than before. For Damien Brooks, these results confirmed what he had already sensed. Ethan was not simply a talented healer. He was someone who understood people in a way that many leaders never learned. However, the attention surrounding Ethan also created new challenges inside the royal court. Some nobles quietly questioned why the Alpha King spent so much time listening to someone without a noble background. They believed tradition existed to protect the kingdom and worried that allowing outside voices to influence royal decisions could change the balance of power they had known for generations. Damien heard these concerns, but he refused to judge Ethan based on the opinions of people who had never taken the time to understand him. Instead, he continued observing Ethan's actions. One morning, Damien invited Ethan to join a small discussion about improving medical support throughout the kingdom. The healer arrived expecting to provide information and leave afterward, but he quickly realized the king wanted his actual perspective. During the meeting, several advisors presented complicated plans filled with formal language and traditional methods. Ethan listened patiently before explaining that many ideas looked effective on paper, but would be difficult for ordinary communities to follow. He suggested simpler approaches based on what he had learned from traveling between villages. His recommendations were practical, clear, and focused on the people who would actually use them. Damien watched as the room slowly changed. At first, some advisors seemed uncertain about accepting advice from an Omega healer. But as Ethan explained each idea with confidence and respect, their doubts began to disappear. He was not challenging the palace. He was helping it understand the reality beyond its walls. After the meeting, Damien walked with Ethan through the palace gardens. The king asked why he never seemed frustrated when people underestimated him. Ethan smiled and explained that he had spent many years being overlooked. Eventually, he learned that proving his value was less important than continuing to do meaningful work. Those words stayed with Damien. The king had spent his entire life proving himself to others, carrying the expectations of a crown that never allowed weakness. Ethan, despite having far less power, possessed a kind of confidence Damien rarely saw. He did not need approval to know his purpose. That realization changed something inside the Alpha King. For the first time, Damien began wondering whether strength was only about control and authority. Perhaps true strength also came from trusting others and allowing different perspectives to exist beside his own. Meanwhile, whispers continued spreading throughout the palace. Some admired Ethan, while others remained determined to protect old traditions. A small group of nobles started searching for ways to limit Ethan's influence without openly confronting the king. They believed Damien would eventually recognize the risk of allowing such a close connection to form. But they misunderstood something important. Damien was not impressed by Ethan because of his skills alone. He valued the healer because Ethan reminded him of the person he had almost forgotten how to be. And as the palace slowly changed around them, neither man realized that their growing trust would soon become the center of the greatest discussion the kingdom had ever seen. The growing connection between Damien Brooks and Ethan Hayes became impossible for the royal court to ignore, and with every passing week, the quiet discussions inside the palace became louder. Many people admired the improvements Ethan had helped create, but others focused only on the fact that an Omega healer from outside the traditional noble circles now had the attention of the Alpha King. The disagreement was not about Ethan's abilities. Even his critics could not deny the positive changes happening throughout the kingdom. The real concern was that someone without a powerful family name had gained a level of trust that many nobles spent their entire lives trying to achieve. Damien noticed the change in atmosphere during every council meeting. Advisors who once welcomed only familiar voices now carefully considered Ethan's suggestions. Some accepted the new ideas, while others remained distant, believing the old systems should never be questioned. The Alpha King understood that change was never easy, especially inside. A place where tradition had shaped every decision for generations. However, he also knew that protecting outdated habits simply because they were familiar would prevent the kingdom from growing. Ethan, meanwhile, remained focused on his responsibilities and seemed unaware of the attention surrounding him. He continued spending his days improving medical programs, training young healers, and reviewing information from communities across the kingdom. When people thanked him, he always reminded them that progress came from everyone working together. Damien often watched these moments from a distance, realizing that Ethan possessed a rare ability to bring people together without demanding authority. One afternoon, a private council meeting was held to discuss the future of Ethan's involvement with royal projects. Several nobles carefully explained that they respected Ethan's work but believed his role should remain limited. They suggested that all recommendations should pass through additional layers of approval before reaching the king. Their words sounded reasonable, but Damien recognized the hidden purpose behind them. The proposed changes were not designed to improve efficiency. They were designed to create distance between Ethan and the royal court. Instead of responding immediately, Damien asked a simple question. He wanted to know how many people supporting the restrictions had personally visited the communities affected by Ethan's work. The room became quiet. Very few could answer. Damien calmly explained that leadership required understanding reality beyond palace walls. A ruler could not make decisions based only on reports written by people who had never experienced the challenges themselves. After the meeting, Ethan approached Damien and expressed concern. He worried that his presence was creating tension within the palace. He told the king that he could return to traveling between villages if that would make things easier. Damien was surprised by the suggestion because Ethan was once again thinking about everyone except himself. The Alpha King told him that leaving would not solve the real problem. The problem was not Ethan's presence. The problem was that some people were afraid of positive change. For the first time, Ethan saw how strongly Damien believed in him. It was not the support of a ruler protecting a useful advisor. It was the trust of someone who had finally found a person he could rely on. Neither of them realized that this quiet conversation would soon become important, because the palace was about to witness a moment that would reveal just how much Ethan had changed the Alpha King's world. The days after the council discussion brought a different atmosphere to the royal palace. The tension between tradition and change remained, but Damien Brooks no longer saw Ethan Hayes as someone who needed protection from criticism alone. He saw him as someone whose presence reminded the entire kingdom what leadership was supposed to represent. Ethan continued his work as usual, unaware that many conversations throughout the palace now centered around his influence. He spent each morning reviewing medical reports, organizing new training materials, and meeting with healers who traveled from distant regions to learn from his methods. Even with growing recognition, Ethan remained exactly the same person Damien had met months earlier. He still thanked every assistant who helped him, still listened carefully to every concern, and still believed the smallest acts of kindness could create lasting change. Damien admired that consistency more than any achievement written in official records. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, Ethan remained inside the palace library reviewing documents from several villages. He had promised himself he would finish only a few more notes before resting, but the hours passed quickly. Surrounded by books, medical records, and handwritten observations, Ethan eventually became too tired to continue and quietly fell asleep. When Damien entered the library later that night, he expected to find unfinished reports waiting for his review. Instead, he found Ethan resting peacefully among the pages that represented months of dedication. The scene immediately changed something inside the Alpha King. For years, Damien had been surrounded by people who needed something from him. Advisors needed decisions, nobles needed approval, and citizens needed leadership. But Ethan was different. Even when exhausted, Ethan had been thinking about how to help others. Damien looked at the healer and realized that the person who spent so much time caring for everyone else rarely allowed anyone to care for him. The king remained nearby, quietly making sure Ethan could rest without interruption. It was not a grand royal gesture. It was a simple moment of trust. However, that simple moment carried more meaning than Damien expected. Later that night, several members of the royal court arrived at the library searching for the king. They stopped when they saw the unusual scene before them. The most powerful alpha in the kingdom, a person known for his emotional distance, had chosen to remain beside an Omega healer who had fallen asleep after giving everything he had to others. No one spoke. The silence inside the library said more than any announcement could have. The nobles who once questioned Ethan began seeing the situation differently. They finally understood that Damien's support was not based only on Ethan's skills or the improvements he created. There was genuine trust between them. The following morning, rumors spread throughout the palace, but for once, Damien did not attempt to control every conversation. He understood that some truths did not need official explanations. They simply needed to be seen. When Ethan woke, he immediately worried that he had caused inconvenience. Damien assured him that resting was not a weakness and that even the strongest people needed moments to recover. Ethan quietly accepted those words, not realizing how significant that moment had been. The palace had witnessed the beginning of a change that would affect everyone. The Alpha King who once stood alone had finally allowed someone to stand beside him, and the entire kingdom was about to discover why that connection mattered. The morning after the library incident arrived with a sense of curiosity throughout the royal palace. Everyone had heard different versions of what happened, but the meaning behind the moment remained the same. The Alpha King, who had always maintained careful distance from everyone around him, had shown a level of trust toward Ethan Hayes that no one expected. Yet when Ethan entered the palace halls that morning, he behaved exactly as he always had. He greeted the staff, reviewed his medical notes, and continued his work without any awareness of how much attention surrounded him. To Ethan, the previous night was simply a moment when he had become too tired after completing his responsibilities. He never imagined that such an ordinary moment could change how others viewed him. Damien noticed this immediately. The king had expected Ethan to feel uncomfortable after realizing how many people had witnessed the situation. Instead, Ethan remained focused on helping others. That quiet confidence reminded Damien why he trusted him in the first place. Ethan was not interested in the image of being close to the throne. He cared only about making sure his work continued to benefit the kingdom. As the days passed, the relationship between the palace and Ethan began to change. The same nobles who once questioned his presence started asking for his advice. Young healers inside the capital requested opportunities to learn from him. Officials who had previously relied only on traditional methods began considering new approaches. The transformation was not sudden, but it was noticeable. Ethan had never attempted to force change. He simply continued showing people another way forward. Damien watched this development carefully. He understood that the kingdom was not changing because of royal commands. It was changing because people were beginning to believe that improvement was possible. One afternoon, Damien and Ethan walked through the palace gardens while discussing future plans for the medical programs. The conversation began with reports and strategies, but eventually moved toward more personal topics. Ethan admitted that he still struggled to believe he belonged in such an important place. He had spent most of his life moving from one community to another, helping people before leaving again. Staying somewhere permanently felt unfamiliar. Damien listened quietly before telling him that belonging was not something granted by titles or traditions. It was created by the impact someone had on the people around them. Ethan considered those words carefully because they reflected something he had never allowed himself to believe. For years, he measured his value by how much he could give. Damien was the first person to remind him that he was also allowed to receive kindness. Meanwhile, the palace continued watching the unusual bond between them. Some people saw hope in it, while others remained uncertain. However, even those who resisted the changes could not deny one fact. The Alpha King had become different since Ethan arrived. He was more willing to listen, more open to new ideas, and less isolated behind the responsibilities of his crown. The person who once carried every burden alone had finally found someone who understood him without demanding anything in return. Neither Damien nor Ethan realized that their connection had already become a symbol throughout the kingdom. Soon, the entire palace would face a moment where everyone would have to decide whether they valued old traditions more than the future they could create together. The changes spreading through the royal palace became impossible to ignore as more people began recognizing the value of Ethan Hayes' work. What started as a simple effort to improve medical support had slowly become a movement that connected the palace with communities across the kingdom. Yet despite the growing respect around him, Ethan remained the same person who had arrived with a small medical bag and a desire to help. He still spent his mornings reviewing reports, still thanked every assistant who supported him, and still believed that every person deserved patience and understanding. Damian Brooks admired that about him more than anything else. The Alpha King had spent years surrounded by individuals who adjusted their behavior depending on who held power. Ethan never did that. He treated everyone with the same honesty, whether speaking with a village family or standing beside the ruler of the kingdom. That sincerity became the reason Damian trusted him so deeply. As the palace prepared for a formal gathering celebrating the improvements across several regions, Ethan found himself uncomfortable with the attention. He had never wanted public recognition, and he worried that people were focusing too much on him instead of the many individuals who had contributed to the progress. Damian noticed his hesitation and reminded him that accepting gratitude did not mean seeking praise. Sometimes people needed the opportunity to thank those who had helped them. During the celebration, representatives from different communities arrived at the palace to share their experiences. They spoke about stronger support systems, better cooperation among healers, and the hope they felt because someone had finally listened to their concerns. Ethan accepted their words quietly, always redirecting appreciation toward the entire community. Damian watched from nearby, realizing that Ethan's greatest strength was not simply his knowledge. It was his ability to make people feel valued. However, not everyone attending the gathering shared the same feelings. Some nobles continued believing that Ethan's growing influence represented a challenge to the traditional order. They watched the connection between the Alpha King and the Omega Healer carefully, searching for signs that Damian had allowed personal feelings to affect his judgment. But what they failed to understand was that Damian's decisions had never been based on emotion alone. Every choice was supported by evidence, results, and the improvement of the kingdom. Later that evening, after the celebration ended, Ethan quietly stepped away from the crowded hall. He found a peaceful corner of the palace gardens where he could think without constant attention. Damian eventually found him there and asked what was on his mind. Ethan admitted that he was grateful for everything that had happened, but he still wondered whether someone like him truly belonged in the royal world. Damian looked at him and explained that the palace had spent years searching for people who could strengthen the kingdom, but few had brought the kind of change Ethan created simply by caring about others. The conversation remained quiet, but its meaning stayed with both of them. For Ethan, it was the first time someone had told him that he did not need to earn his place through endless service. For Damian, it was another reminder that the person beside him had changed more than policies and traditions. Ethan had changed the way he viewed connection itself. As the night continued, the palace slowly became aware that something important was happening. The bond between the Alpha King and the Omega Healer was no longer just a private friendship. It had become a symbol of a new era, one where trust could overcome old boundaries. And soon, the entire kingdom would witness the final moment that revealed just how much Damian had changed. The entire kingdom had changed, but the greatest transformation was not found in the halls of the palace or written in official records. It existed in the way people looked at their ruler. Damian Brooks was still the Alpha King who carried responsibility with unmatched dedication, but the distance that once surrounded him had disappeared. The people who served him noticed that he listened more carefully, considered new perspectives, and allowed others to stand beside him instead of carrying every burden alone. The reason behind that change was clear to everyone who had watched the journey unfold. Ethan Hayes had entered the palace as a healer with no title, no powerful family, and no desire for recognition. Yet through patience, honesty, and compassion, he had changed the heart of the kingdom itself. The moment that revealed the truth came during a formal gathering where representatives from every region arrived at the palace. They came not only to discuss future plans, but also to express gratitude for the improvements that had reached their communities. As the gathering continued, many people noticed something unusual. Damian no longer stood apart from everyone else. Ethan stood beside him, not as someone seeking importance, but as someone who had earned trust through his actions. The palace that once questioned their connection now understood its meaning. They were not simply two people from different worlds. They represented the possibility of a kingdom built on understanding rather than tradition alone. During the gathering, Damien spoke about the future of the kingdom and recognized the contributions of healers, communities, and ordinary people who had worked together to create change. He made it clear that progress did not belong to one person. It belonged to everyone willing to care and cooperate. Ethan listened quietly, knowing that the words reflected everything he believed in. After the ceremony ended, the two walked through the palace gardens where their journey had begun to change. Ethan admitted that he never expected his life to lead him to such a place. He had always believed his role was to help others and continue moving forward. Damien smiled and told him that sometimes the people who never search for influence are the ones who create the greatest impact. Those words stayed with Ethan because they represented something he had slowly learned throughout his time at the palace. He was not there because of a position or because someone needed his skills. He was there because his presence mattered. Damien also understood something important. A crown could command attention, but it could not create genuine connection. For years, he had believed that being a strong ruler meant standing alone. Ethan showed him that true strength also came from trusting others and allowing people to share the weight of responsibility. As the seasons changed, the kingdom entered a new era. The medical systems continued improving. The relationship between the palace and its people grew stronger, and old traditions began making room for better ideas. The story of the Alpha King and the Omega Healer became more than a story about unexpected connection. It became a reminder that even the strongest person could discover a new path when they allowed someone sincere to enter their world. And within the palace that once felt cold and distant, a new beginning quietly took place, built on trust, respect, and the belief that the future could always become better.